Wii Sports Club is a very strange game. It's the third game in the Wii Sports series, but it's not exactly a fresh new entry. It's more of a remake of the original, with updated controls, visuals, and added online play. But sadly, it fails to live up to the original game's greatness, and it loses sight of what made this series so special in the first place. There's still some fun to be had with Wii Sports Club, but it's not exactly a worthy follow-up to the previous game in the series, Wii Sports Resort. I usually try to stay pretty positive on this channel and only talk about the things I really enjoy, but I want to cover this game since the Wii Sports series means so much to me, and I think this game is a really fascinating example of how to take an insanely popular video game franchise and suddenly turn it into something that feels outdated and boring. I mean, the first two Wii Sports games have sold over 115 million copies combined, where I can't even find any sales numbers for Wii Sports Club. It never even made it onto the top 20 bestsellers list for the Wii U, meaning that it was at least under 1 million and probably far below that. And since physical copies of this game are so insanely expensive, I'm going to go ahead and guess that it didn't sell very well. You'd think that a series as massively popular as Wii Sports would be able to be at least somewhat successful, but sadly that isn't the case. So what went wrong? Well, a lot of things did. The most obvious reason for Wii Sports Club's failure is the platform it was released on, the Wii U. It's no secret at this point that the Wii U didn't sell very well, meaning that any game released on the console was already at a huge disadvantage from the start. But just because a game is released on the Wii U doesn't automatically make it a failure. Look at games like Mario Kart 8 and the original Splatoon. Those games were able to be moderate successes despite releasing on the Wii U. I think the other two big factors contributing to Wii Sports Club's downfall was the release strategy and the game itself. The game contains just the original 5 sports from the first game, which instantly makes it a lot less interesting to consumers because everyone has already played these sports before. And to make things even worse, Nintendo decided to release this game in the weirdest way possible, making things super confusing. When the game was first released in late 2013, it was a digital eShop title that only had tennis and bowling, with the other sports being added in later. So sadly, Nintendo Switch Sports isn't the only time that a Wii Sports game has launched and then received additional sports later. Once you download the digital version of Wii Sports Club, you get 24 hours of free access to any of the sports. But once that runs out, you'll have to either purchase another day pass for $2 for another 24 hours of playtime, or purchase the sports individually for $10 each. Golf was added in about a month later, and 6 months after that, boxing and baseball were added. And then a month after that, a physical version of the game was released that contained all 5 sports without any paywalls. Did I mention that this is confusing? Because wow, none of this makes any sense. I own a physical copy of Wii Sports Club, so luckily I have access to all of the sports from the start and don't have to deal with any strange purchasing options. I don't know why Nintendo thought it was a good idea to take a game as simple as Wii Sports and give it the most complex release strategy ever. This will be a common theme with this game, where things are often made unnecessarily complicated. Offering so many different ways to purchase this game just confuses customers. I feel so bad for the retail employees who had to explain all of this to parents who simply asked how they could buy the new Wii Sports game for their kid. A huge reason why the original Wii Sports was such a big deal was because it came packaged with the console, and it was as simple as that. Having a purchasing system where you can buy the sports individually or rent them for a limited amount of time is such a strange decision, and I think it's a big reason why this game sold so poorly. I think that's enough backstory for now, so let's jump into the game itself and see how it holds up. Here we have the main menu, where you can see the 5 different sports available and your club in the top left. You're supposed to join the club that matches where you live, and then compare all your stats and records with the other members of your club. I'm not really sure what the point of the club system is. I guess it's kind of cool to see what players near you are doing, but honestly I don't think it's all that interesting. There's a big leaderboard that ranks all the different clubs based on the average of all the players, which is kind of weird because you don't really have any control over that. Like, you could be the best Wii Sports player in the world, but if the other members of your club have low scores, your club won't make it very far up the leaderboard. So we're kind of off to a bad start, as I don't really like the feature that the game was named after. But let's get into the actual gameplay by playing the sports. Overall, the basic gameplay of Wii Sports Club still holds up really well, and the more accurate controls thanks to the Wii Motion Plus are appreciated. But the most obvious thing right off the bat is the different visual style. The colors are a lot more muted and less colorful. I think they were trying to go with a more naturalistic visual approach. I can get what they were trying to do here, but honestly I think it just looks worse. Tennis and golf are easily the most affected sports, since both have a lot of green, and this new darker forest green color just looks really strange. Especially when you're playing on the resort courses from Wii Sports Resort. This doesn't feel like a tropical location at all, even though Woohoo Island is in the background. I mean, the audience members in tennis are actually fully modeled this time, which is nice, but the way they decided to add more detail to the tennis court itself is just by adding some dirty patches here and there, which just feels weird. Although it fits the theme of this game, an old worn-out court that no one really plays on anymore is actually perfect for Wii Sports Club. Okay, I'm being pretty harsh. If you can't tell already, I'm not exactly a big fan of this game. Let's get back to talking about the gameplay, starting with tennis. Tennis is actually pretty great in this game. You have a lot more control over your racket and swinging feels great. They also added in a new mechanic where your opponent can stumble and send the ball high up into the air, where you can spike it back down extra hard. This feature is technically from table tennis in Wii Sports Resort, but it's great to see it brought over to normal tennis. This new move is an improvement on the original Wii Sports gameplay, which is exactly what this game should have focused on, improving the sports gameplay while keeping the basic controls the same. One slightly strange thing I noticed though was that I could pull off fastball serves a lot easier than normal, and my opponents had a harder time returning them. Maybe this is because of the more precise controls, but sometimes it felt like I was cheating because I was serving fastballs over and over again. Once you start facing higher difficulty opponents, the gameplay gets pretty intense and is actually a lot of fun, and thankfully you can still play an entire match against yourself. One tiny little issue I have with this version of tennis is that when you first start the game, the camera doesn't pan down to the court like it used to, which takes away some of the personality. The extra training modes in tennis have you returning balls through rings to score points, hitting moles with tennis balls, and trying to leave this duck around the court to cover as much distance as possible. These extra modes are pretty fun, and they're basically the only new content added to the game. I do find myself missing the target wall one from the original though. If we're talking about just the gameplay and not the visuals, I might actually prefer this new version of tennis over the original. Another small stupid thing that probably shouldn't matter but still annoys me is the new system for leveling up. I'm okay with the idea of levels rather than a point meter, but I missed the graph from the first two games. This graph shows you your journey to the top in a clear and easily understandable way, while this new level system feels a lot more basic. Quick side note, I'm happy to see the take a break soon message is still here. Next up is another sport they actually handled pretty well, bowling. The new background environments for the bowling alley look really great, even if they still have the same muted colors as the rest of the game. But since it's indoors and there isn't much plant life, the visuals don't bother me quite as much. And yes, you can still throw the bowling ball behind you to make the Miis freak out, which sadly might be the last time you can do that in a Wii Sports game since Nintendo Switch Sports doesn't seem to have this fun Easter egg. The bowling gameplay itself feels very similar to how it was in Wii Sports Resort, which isn't a bad thing. There isn't really any gameplay improvements to bowling, but that's okay because it's a pretty straightforward sport. 100-pin bowling returns, which means once again I have to try and get the secret Easter egg where you can cause a sonic boom by throwing the ball all the way down the side banister. I did finally manage to get it though, so I can confirm that it is in the game. Then there's spin control, where you bowl while avoiding obstacles. The training minigames have some fun stuff like practicing picking up spares, and trying to nail really difficult pin layouts. Once again, this sport is actually pretty solid. I think I slightly prefer bowling from Wii Sports Resort, just because of the original announcer and more colorful visuals, but bowling in Wii Sports Club is really good. So you might be wondering, so far all of the sports have been great, why does everyone say this game is bad? Well, that's what I was wondering too, but sadly the last three sports have a ton more problems. Next up there's golf, which is easily the worst version of golf in the whole series, mainly because of the gamepad. You may have noticed that I haven't even mentioned the gamepad yet, and that's because tennis and bowling actually don't use the gamepad at all, which is probably why I enjoyed those sports. In golf you have to set the gamepad on the floor in front of you, where you can see the golf ball as if it was really in front of you. I don't have any problem with this, and it's a cute little feature, but they made the insane decision to display your power bar on the gamepad screen and not on the TV. So when you're practicing your shots, you have to be staring down at the tiny gamepad on the floor to try and gauge your power levels. But the map of the course is still on the TV, so you have to constantly keep looking between the two to try and get a good shot. Restricting the power meter to the gamepad is actually super annoying, and it totally ruins the golf gameplay for me. As far as I can tell, there's absolutely no way to get the power bar on the TV, so you're forced to use the gamepad, which makes this sport worse than the original from 2008 in my opinion. Then for some reason there's a replay that plays after every single shot you take. You can skip it, but it's still annoying. Like I just barely did that, I don't need to see a full replay of it. The new courses aren't as well designed as the old ones. I mean, this one just has the text Wii U in the middle of a lake. And as my final complaint for this sport, I just have to talk about the visuals again. The colors are just so bland and uninteresting, and the trees look just as bad as they did on the Wii, except now in higher resolution so they're way more noticeable. Seeing the ball on the gamepad in the sand or deep grass is pretty cool, but it in no way makes up for the compromised gameplay that forces you to play in one specific way. The training minigames include one where you practice putting the whole time, which is like my worst nightmare. The one thing that will never change with Wii Sports Golf is that I'm the king of choking at the last second while putting. The other training modes have you playing bingo and trying to hit a big target in the middle of a lake. These are fine, but they're made so much worse by the power meter still being stuck on the gamepad. so Wii Sports Club Golf is pretty bad, and it really isn't that much fun to play anymore. Then there's baseball, which would be pretty inoffensive if it wasn't for its forced-in gamepad support. The hitting gameplay is pretty unchanged, but now when you're pitching you have to pick up the gamepad and aim it at the TV and press a button to throw. I feel like this takes a lot of the fun out of pitching, as you're not even throwing using motion controls anymore, you're just pressing a button, which is lame. Then when someone hits the ball into the air, you have to hold the gamepad up to the sky and focus on the ball to catch it. This is actually kind of fun, and I like that it adds in some skill instead of just relying on luck. Normally you just have to hope your Mii catches it, but now you can make sure they always catch it. Catching baseballs falling from the sky is easily the best use of the gamepad in this game, but it still feels really weird to use the gamepad while playing Wii Sports, and it's really awkward to switch between the two controllers constantly. Training has a home run contest, practicing aiming your shot by breaking walls, and pitching and catching practice using the gamepad. The only thing I really like about these modes is that in the pitching one you have to catch all sorts of weird items like pumpkins and hamburgers. This is the last sport that makes use of the gamepad, which is really strange. Only 2 of the 5 sports even use the gamepad, so I don't know why they even bothered at all. If they were trying to prove why the gamepad is useful, Nintendo Land already did that and did it way better. The minigames in that game are actually impossible without the gamepad, but in Wii Sports Club, the gamepad support just feels super forced. If you're going to base a game around a gimmick, you have to make sure that it's both fun and feels intuitive. The original Wii Sports did this very well with motion controls, and again, Nintendo Land already did this for the gamepad. And finally, there's boxing, which is probably the sport that changed the most, and in all the wrong ways. Wii Sports Club's version of boxing feels lifeless and boring. The camera is zoomed out super far and the animations feel really stiff. To play this sport, you have to use 2 Wii remotes with the Wii Motion Plus attached, and if you only have one, you can only use one hand, which isn't fun at all. I get that this will make the gameplay more precise, but I think that's way too many requirements to just play boxing. They also added a new mechanic where after a certain number of hits, stars will appear above the Mii's head and they can't punch for a couple of seconds. Unlike the new slam move in tennis, this new mechanic makes the gameplay feel worse. It feels cheap when it happens to you, and it feels cheap when you're unloading on an enemy who can't even defend themselves. But probably the biggest thing that absolutely ruins this sport is that once you throw a punch, you lose all momentum and stand completely still. This makes things feel more like a puzzle than a fight, as you have to time your punches perfectly or you'll leave yourself wide open for attacks. This makes boxing feel a lot less intense and really takes the fun out of it. Just take a look at these 2 clips of gameplay, one from the first Wii Sports and one from Wii Sports Club.
Fight!
There's so many differences between these 2 versions of boxing. The original has sound effects that feel more impactful, a slow motion effect when you get hit that sells the impact of the punch, and a really cool blur effect when you successfully dodge a punch. The knockout animations are also way more interesting in the original, where the Mii's ragdoll and fly all over the place, where in Wii Sports Club they just fall to the ground in a pre-made animation. I could keep listing differences, but I think you get the idea. Boxing is the sport that this game ruined the most. It feels almost nothing like it used to and it isn't even fun to play anymore. Plus Matt is nowhere to be seen. He's not the final champion and he's not in the training modes. All there is this blonde dude named Matt, which is really creepy.
What did they do to Matt? Is he alright? Where did he go? Who is this imposter?
The controls also feel worse to me. I could never manage to pull off an uppercut when I wanted to, which defeats the purpose of using 2 Wii remotes if I still can't get the punches I want. The enemy AI also feels a lot worse. They just kind of dodge back and forth constantly and throw a couple punches every now and then. The one new thing I actually like about this sport is the cute little cutscenes that play in between rounds. You could probably still find some enjoyment out of this sport. I mean, you are still punching a Mii in the face over and over, but it's just so much worse than the original. Maybe they saw the very low sales numbers and decided to rush out this sport instead of polishing it up, but boxing is by far the worst sport of this game. And that's most of the content from Wii Sports Club. Online play was also a big feature at the time of release, but it's basically impossible to find an opponent these days as no one is playing this game anymore. I was able to play a couple online matches though, thanks to the lovely people in the Wii Sports Discord server. Tennis and baseball worked pretty well, but in golf and bowling you have to wait and watch everyone take their turn, which feels super slow. And boxing had some pretty bad connection issues. But it's still really awesome to actually play Wii Sports online with other people. Until Nintendo Switch Sports happened, this was the only official way to play a Wii Sports game online. Stamps were also added in, which is nice and gives you something to work towards besides high scores, but the gameplay isn't fun enough for me to want to devote enough time to collect them all. One other thing I want to mention is the music. There are some decently good songs here, but once again the sports themes themselves are inferior to the originals. Take a listen to the difference between the boxing results in Wii Sports Club and the boxing results in Wii Sports. The Wii Sports Club song isn't terrible, but it's nowhere near as great as the original. At the end of the day, some small part of me will always like this game because of how much I love Wii Sports. Playing these sports will always bring me some amount of happiness, but Wii Sports Club is really just a worse version of the original game, and I'd rather play the Wii original anytime I want to play these sports. Wii Sports Resort took the series to new heights with its fresh new gameplay and huge amount of brand new sports, so it's really sad that the series took such a huge step backwards with Wii Sports Club. The beauty of the first Wii Sports was its simplicity. Wii Sports Club adds unnecessary complexity to everything with gimmicky gamepad support, more complicated controls, and a confusing release strategy. And with blander visuals that take away a lot of the personality of Wii Sports, you're left with a disappointing end product that doesn't live up to the other games in the series. But luckily the Wii Sports series seems to be getting a second chance with the new upcoming Nintendo Switch Sports. And while it doesn't look perfect, I'm guessing it will at least be more enjoyable than Wii Sports Club. And that's pretty much it for this video. Sorry for being so harsh on this game. I don't absolutely hate it or anything, I just think it isn't nearly as good as the first two games. But it isn't like my life is ruined just because this game exists. Honestly, I find it pretty interesting how Nintendo managed to mess this up as bad as they did. But I'm really looking forward to their next attempt to bring back Wii Sports. And from what we've seen so far and what I've played of the game during the beta, Nintendo Switch Sports will be a big step in the right direction. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see ya in the next one.